So thank you for the introduction. I'm actually Spanish, but I work in Paris, so I do also speak Spanish, if anyone wonders. And I'm going to quickly do an introduction on clinical trials in general, implementation procedures, and what does this imply or see for patients. So I imagine everyone knows, but just a quick recap. So clinical research, which is all scientific studies performed on human subjects with the intent to extend medical and biological knowledge. We've got retrospective studies, which are databases, and then we've got prospective studies. And in prospective studies, we could divide this in observational studies. So we've heard about natural history studies, cross-sectional studies. But then we've got interventional studies, and here we find clinical trials, which is a research study in which one or more human participants are assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects. This is the definition in 2019 of the NIH. What's the aim of a clinical trial? Well, to test new drugs or a combination of drugs, to test new modes of administration, and to test new therapeutic techniques. And there are different phase trials. So we can have phase 1 clinical trials, which is the first phase in humans. We are going to assess tolerance and pharmacokinetics of interventions. We've got phase 2, where in a small group of patients, we will see what's the effect of the treatment and what's especially the optimal dose, and measure adverse effects. And then we will go into the classical clinical trial that we know, which is the phase 3 clinical trial, which is a larger patient population. And here we will really test the interventional molecule at the optimal dose and see what's the effect, with, at the end, an application for marketing authorization if the clinical trial is positive. And then there's also a phase 4 or post-marketing phase, where we are going to assess the long-term effects, which might not be obvious from all the other phases of clinical trials. What about clinical research in neuromuscular disorders? So we've assisted to an explosion of clinical research in neuromuscular diseases in the last years. There are more than 900 clinical protocols in clinicaltrials.gov. We've got all those observational studies, so natural history studies, disease registries, biomarker development, which makes a clinical trial ready. And then we've got the clinical trials itself, which will help develop and approve innovative treatment strategies. So this is opening new therapeutic options for neuromuscular patients. This is increasing the number of tested molecules, improving the accuracy of outcome measures, which we hope will improve patient clinical care in the end. And just a quick touch on the fact that there are many highly targeted molecules that are being developed in neuromuscular disorders, such as antisense oligonucleotides, cellular therapy, small molecules, AAV-mediated gene therapy, and enzyme replacement therapy, depending on the neuromuscular condition. What are the challenges in clinical trial design for neuromuscular disorders? So first, neuromuscular disorders are a wide group of rare diseases, which is characterized by high genetic and phenotypic heterogeneity. We see this in limb girdle disorders. Preclinical and clinical development of new effective treatments is often limited by several of these factors. So we've said pathogenic and genetic mechanisms, which are heterogeneous, sometimes not completely understood. Disease incidence and prevalence are frequently low, so we have some difficulties identifying investigators, identifying patients. Disease progression can be slow, sometimes very slow, and this is difficult to appreciate the change in a short fragment of time, so big economic burden. Identification, recruitment, and retention of eligible subjects can be challenging. Administration route, which need to be highly targeted if we want to target the muscle. Outcome measures can be missing or not very sensitive. We heard about this earlier this morning. And the rarity of some neuromuscular disorders make classical designs, sometimes classical study designs, sometimes unfit to respond to the questions that the neuromuscular community needs to address. And then there are some challenges in pediatric clinical trials because FKRP is also sometimes a pediatric or frequently a pediatric disease. So first, there are ethical questions. So is the question that the clinical trial trying to answer, is it worth asking? Does the project helps answer this question? Can we get this answer with adults? Or do we absolutely need pediatric patients? Is information to the patient and parents sufficient? How will recruitment go? What's the benefit-risk ratio? And questions around approval and consent. So we need to seek the child's consent using age-appropriate information systems, consent before or after the age of writing. We need to stratify data according for age because psychomotor development takes place. We can have recruitment difficulties because of concerns on child safety, because of constraints and lack of time, and we need to adapt pharmacokinetics, which might be different from adult to child patients. There has been an evolution of clinical trial design in neuromuscular disorders because of all these challenges that I have just addressed. So recruitment of sufficient sample size can be challenging in the disease, and long observation time can sometimes be difficult if the disease, for example, is rapidly progressive. The gold standard we know is a randomized clinical control clinical trial, but there are some alternatives that we are discussing more and more, like the use of historical controls. So using all the published information as a control for a therapy. Patients acting as their own control. So sometimes patients that have the treatment and a placebo or no treatment, and using alternative designs that are being developed and used more and more frequently. Another challenge that I've already discussed is the fact that recruitment and retention can be sometimes difficult in neuromuscular disorders. We know that recruitment should not exceed 2 and 3 years. It should be most effective if the disease is rapidly progressive. It's important to pre-screen eligible subjects so that we can be on available health records and create disease registries so that when a clinical trial has to take place, we are ready to include patients. And recruitment should be focused on patients that are likely also to complete the clinical trial to reduce the loss to follow-up patients. And this can be achieved in multiple ways, so like increasing informed consent of patients should include a clear explanation of what the clinical trial is going to require and what's the commitment for the participation. We need to avoid a loss of contact, so build a strong relationship between investigators and patients, facilitate patient transport, improve comfort during on-visit, and increase of home and virtual visits, which have been vastly developed after COVID, and during and after COVID. This is just the case in our center, as well as in many other centers. We have the advantage and to have a clinical research unit, which is very helpful in coordinating all this and dealing with all these challenges. This is clearly important. And so now going really into the patient perspective, so what the participation of a patient in a clinical trial, what does it involve? So taking part in a clinical trials, well, first of all, it offers the opportunity for patients to access innovative treatments and contribute to progress in the search of new treatments in the disease. And it's especially relevant for patients with rare and severe diseases where there is not an effective therapy. How, very simply, a clinical trial is conducted. So there is a part where the patient is not involved and a part where the patient starts to be involved. There is before inclusion, well, an administrative implementation, setup of clinical centers and personnel, participant selection based on clinical records, and then patients are included. We inform selected participants. Patients can give their informed consent from signature. We validate the inclusion criteria, and the clinical trial starts, ends, and we have results. The patients and the family are informed of the start of a new clinical trial by the doctor or patient association. The doctor should inform the patient of the aims of the study, the treatment that will be tested, their side effects, and the follow-up exams that will be performed. And the patient should receive an information letter, so everything should be written, and give a written informed consent before any inclusion. The selection phase, and I'm going to the end of my talk. So it starts with the signature of the informed consent form. We verify that there are no contraindications to the patient's participation in the trial, so we check inclusion and exclusion criteria. Participants in a clinical study must meet specific criteria, which are defined by the protocol and specific to each study. And to decide on the inclusion of a person in the trial, the principal investigator relies on those criteria that have been defined on the protocol. So just to point out that participation in a research study begins with the signature of the informed consent form and not the administration of the treatment, and there are no research procedures that can be performed before this informed consent. After the inclusion, well, we've got the protocol is organized in several visits with specific assessments to test treatment efficacy. The treatment is administered according to the modalities that are indicated in the protocol. We monitor adverse effects, and the duration of the protocol may vary greatly depending on the disease, depending on the treatment. Specifically in MMD, well, we evaluate muscle strength using specific tools. We evaluate the performance during the execution of motor tasks. We assess autonomy using dedicated scales, quality of life, patient-reported outcomes. We use this more and more in clinical trials, and as well as other tests. And what happens after the trial? So after the trial, there are different possibilities. We may go into an open label study. So obviously not every participant is going to end the trial at the same time. What happens to the participants that end the trial early? Well, they can go into an open label study where they will keep taking the investigational drug while they await the other patients to end their participation and pending the final results. If the results are positive, well, there is an early access which is granted, and all patients concerned by this access start taking the investigational drug. If the results are unfortunately negative, well, the treatment is discontinued, and then sometimes there are new clinical trials that are started with different investigational drugs, but sometimes just a different framework of the clinical trial. And this is the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'll respond to questions later. Thank you.